All right. Well, my name is Dr. Rebecca Mears. I'm with the VIN Foundation and VIN. Really excited to have you all here today. I'm also joined by Jordan Benchia, who's the Executive Director of VIN Foundation, and we'll also be joined by Dr. Tony Bartels. Tony and I do a lot of student debt education for VIN and VIN Foundation. So really excited to bring this event to you all and discuss applying to vet school, which is really exciting. I wanted to take a second to try and tell you a little bit about VIN Foundation. I know it's something that many of you are not familiar with. We are a nonprofit, so all of the resources that VIN Foundation offers are free. The goal is to be a resource for veterinarians all throughout their career. So starting with pre-vets, vet students, and then throughout the career up to retirement. So there's a wide variety of resources available. I encourage you to definitely check them out. We'll be focusing on our pre-vet resources today, which includes our website, vetschoolbound.org. And so we'll be exploring some of that as well. Before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping things. I try to keep the chat open for any technical issues. If you have questions, you can use the Q&A throughout the presentation. You can ask anonymously. You can also upvote questions. So if you see a question that somebody else has already entered that you also have, if you click that thumbs up button, that'll help to let us know that those are some of the most pressing questions, some of the ones that are the most frequent, and we can sort of prioritize those throughout the presentation. And with that, I'll get us kicked off here. So we're going to talk a lot about applying to vet school today, right? So so many things to talk about there. We'll sort of start off with some questions about you, tell you a little bit about myself, and then we'll go through like what we know, what I think you should know, and then how to manage those things that we discussed today. Oh, let's get anytime that you see one of these orange boxes here, that's a link to this presentation. We'll record this webinar, and then we'll also send out a follow-up email to everyone that registered with the recording, with the Prezi link here as well, that you'll be able to click on all of those links and explore the different resources. So we're going to talk a lot about the vet school costs. What does student debt look like for those that are going to vet school? What's the income for a new grad veterinarian? We'll talk about the different seat options for those of you that are looking to apply to vet school, and then the statistics and about getting into vet school, and then some helpful tips and tools that I have as well. I've got a couple of questions to poll you all and see sort of what we've got. So you can click on this or check out this Menti. You can scan that. I'll have it brought up here in just a second as well, and we'll go through those just so I can get a kind of a feel for where we're all at. So I'll give you a second to go ahead and scan that QR code, or you can join that on your computer if you're on a laptop or something. Perfect. All right, so let's start with our first one here. When you apply to vet school, where will you call home? What will be your state of residence when you apply to vet school? All right, great. Got somebody from Kentucky, Ohio, Illinois, California, it's like a Virginia, Texas. Great. All right. All right, awesome. Thanks, guys. So what I'm looking at when I look here is, is there a vet school that's in these states, or is there not a vet school there? What are some of the options that are going to present to each of you when you're looking at which vet schools to apply to? Next one. What's your current vet school application status? So have you submitted your application for the next class? You're going to be applying a couple cycles away. All right, awesome. We have at least one person that's a gunner and already submitted their application. Good job, you. I will admit that I was one of those people that waited until the last moment. I think I was trying to beat the clock to get my personal statement in when I was applying to vet school. Great. What vet schools are you applying to? What's on if you're a couple cycles away, where are you looking to potentially apply to? What's sort of on your radar? Ohio State, and I have no idea what other ones. All right, I like that. I like the honesty. All right, got UPenn, Cornell, Penn, Minnesota, Florida. I see an RVC, LSU, others that we're still thinking about. Anywhere the livestock is, got it. All right, awesome. Yeah, quite a mix there. All right. So one of the things that I'm looking at here is, the schools that I see listed here, do those overlap with the places that we saw that you would be a resident of when you applied to vet school? All right, we're going to talk some number stuff while we're here. So, how much do you think it will cost you to become a veterinarian? Don't worry, I can't track you down based on your answer. Be like, no, you didn't get it right. All right, great. So we're seeing anywhere from $100,000 up to 400 to $500,000. Seems like everybody's got a pretty good guess there. Yeah, so not too concerned with the number, whatever it takes. All right, I appreciate the honesty. I was getting ready to say I was kind of surprised that none of those last couple of answers were selected there. So honestly, each of these numbers is correct. Really, it depends on where you go to school, what kind of seat status you have. We'll talk a lot about that. But I've definitely, a lot of the work that I do and that Dr. Bartels does as well is educating vet students about student loans, borrowing, and a lot about repayments with both vet students and veterinarians. We do a lot of that consultations and discussing that with veterinarians that are in repayment now. Uh, I'm not too concerned with the number, whatever it takes. I will say that is a bit of a red flag to me, just because these are some pretty big numbers that we're talking about here. So I do want that to be something that you think about as you look at applying to vet school, as you're applying to VMCAS and deciding where you'll go. So definitely keep that in mind, and we'll dive into that a little bit deeper here later on. Any idea of how much a new grad veterinarian earns after vet school? Great. Yeah, seeing some pretty different numbers here. Again, all of the above is correct. I do appreciate the honesty of the person that says, I don't know, and that's why I'm here. Excellent. For those that are doing an internship or a residency after vet school, this $30,000 to $60,000 here is probably a little bit more accurate in those cases. We do see some private practice internships or residencies that might fall into that $60,000 to $90,000. And then seeing up from there. Right out of vet school, the higher than 150 is a little bit more challenging to meet, but we have seen incomes of new grads rising here in the last couple of years. The most recent numbers that I've seen are that on average, new veterinarian graduates that are going into private practice, like a companion animal practice, are making about $125,000 was the average starting salary there. Depending on what type of practice you go into, could be a little bit less than that, and we'll revisit that a little bit later as well. All right, last one here. Just out of my own curiosity, will you start vet school with student debt already? Yes, no, not sure at this point. Great. Yeah, so most this kind of I think reflects what we often see is that a large portion of vet students do come to vet school without student debt. I was one of those that came with the student debt. And so that definitely impacted my decisions about where to go to school, which we'll talk about here in a second. So thank you for that. I appreciate you guys giving me a little bit of information there. It helps to understand where we're going and what we want to focus on. All right. Yeah, so this is a little bit about me. Like I said, I am a veterinarian. I graduated from University of Georgia in 2020. I am what I like to call a single income, two spoiled dog household. You might hear one of them tonight because she's new to this whole webinar thing and still sorting out life. That's Georgie there. She just joined my family in December. This is Remy, who is bathing in his backyard that I bought in there. Uh, so those are my two children, if you will. I was a Delaware resident at the time of my application, so I didn't have a vet school in my state, which, like I said, it did influence my decision. A large part of that is because I wanted to go into equine practice, which does usually mean that you're making a lower salary than my small animal companion colleagues might when they start out after school. I like to travel and things like that, so I like to do all of those things. The other reason that understanding my vet school cost was really important to me was because of this guy right here. This is my dad. My dad was, before I went to vet school, he was diagnosed with primary progressive aphasia, which is a form of dementia. And so my sisters and we are his caregivers. He lives with my oldest sister. She's the primary caregiver, but it is a shared family thing of making the decisions for him. And I was very conscious of my own finances, already having student debt from undergrad and wanting to make sure that I didn't amass a ton more student debt because I want to make sure that I understand my finances and I make the best financial decisions for my family to be able to do everything that I can for my dad and to be able to, do these other things in life that I want to do. And so for me, that was really important. I did end up with about $250,000 worth of student debt by the time that I graduated vet school. Some people might call that a cool $250,000, which I know seems like a very big number. And like I said, for me, this was split between my borrowing that I did for undergrad as well as the borrowing that I did for vet school. Because that was so important to me, I did make a tough decision. I applied to vet school the first year. I was accepted, but as a out-of-state resident. And so I told University of Georgia that thank you, but I would stay on the wait list for the in-state spot, and I would apply again next time for the in-state spot if I didn't get moved up off the wait list there. So that's what I did. Is I ended up applying again, and I was able to secure that contract seat for myself as a Delaware resident going to UGA. That saved me about $120,000 by making that decision. For myself, I knew that reflected basically paying for my vet degree over again. And so again, just a really important decision for me to keep those borrowing costs throughout vet school as low as I possibly could. I am repaying that using an income-driven repayment plan and planning for student loan forgiveness. You might hear a lot about that in the news. That's the method that works well for me based on my student debt to income ratio, as well as my goals in life. A lot of that is influenced by these tools right here. So using studentaid.gov, which is where you apply for FAFSA if you've already started with borrowing through undergrad, and then using the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center tools. These tools are designed around veterinarians and vet students to be able to help us understand borrowing, repayment, and answer a lot of those really important questions. All right, so let's start diving into it. This here is from an older version of the AVMA report on the economic state of the veterinary profession. It's got some really cool information in it. And so what I like to highlight here is we're looking at different schools in the US, comparing these green bars are the median income. So what are those graduates making that first year out of school, compared to the blue bar, which is the amount of student debt that those students on average have from each of those schools. And what you'll notice is the green bar, there's not really a significant difference here, right? By large and far, this green bar is kind of tracking in the same place. But the blue bar, there's quite a bit of difference depending on which school you attend for vet school. We'll definitely notice some trends when we look at some of those more expensive schools. They do tend to be the private schools as compared to the state schools, which do receive some different funding. Looking across the nation at the average student debt of new graduates, we see each year that somewhere often between 15 to 20% of vet students will graduate without student debt. So that all graduates number is a little bit lower there. But then when we're looking at the average student debt across the nation for those with debt, we're looking at about $179,000 right here. There's been some reports, and you'll see this kind of, tapering and maybe even lowering here of this line. I tend not to get too excited about that just because of the pandemic forbearance as a part of COVID. Your vet school loans are different than those of you that already have undergrad debt. Those loans do accrue interest while you're in school, and that was paused for 3.5 years throughout COVID. And so that resulted in a pretty significant saving for a lot of those vet students that had been in school during that time, especially those that really benefited from that interest pause throughout nearly all of their vet school experience. So in addition to that, we're seeing that, student loan interest rates are a little bit higher than we've been seeing the past couple of years. Not surprising coming out of COVID and knowing what's going on with inflation and everything. So I am interested to see kind of what this number does, especially for those of you here that are, maybe a couple of cycles away from applying for vet school. So definitely something to keep an eye on. We talked earlier about already, getting an idea of what vet school costs, and maybe you're kind of rolling your eyes with this conversation and saying that we already know that vet school is expensive. What does it matter? I just want to be a veterinarian. And the reason is because if you haven't heard about some of the well-being considerations in vet med and some of the struggles, I definitely encourage you to reach out to the doctors that you're working with or that and some of those mentors, and ask them those questions. This is from the Merck Animal Well-Being Study. And what we see is that, predictors of well-being, when we're looking at that lower well-being score, a lot of that is associated with, higher student debt being one of those stressors. Again, seeing here from year after year that high student debt levels can be a big stressor on many veterinarians once they graduate vet school. So there's no Harvard effect when we're looking at applying to vet school. This is a common question that I hear from pre-vet students when I'm, either talking to clubs or I was just recently at the APVMA symposium, if you were there as well. And so, it's like, which vet school should I go to? I want to be able to go to the best vet school. And honestly, the best vet school is the one that you get into and it costs you the least. What we see here is that school choice is the most significant factor when we're explaining variations in student debt from vet school. School choice doesn't really have a significant impact on starting salaries. And we saw that in that first graph, right? The blue bar versus the green bar, and being able to see that the incomes didn't really vary by going to some of those more expensive schools or the private schools or anything like that. So, it's not like it is in other industries where by going to certain schools, maybe you're going to land yourself a, better paying job, more influential job. Again, another way of looking at this is that debt from school to school can vary quite a bit, but we're not seeing that variation amongst those starting incomes. The biggest thing that impacts income as a veterinarian is honestly what type of practice you go into and where you go into practice, right? So like location and what area of practice. So for example, like I said, I was an equine veterinarian before I started doing all of this stuff. And unfortunately, equine veterinarians is a little bit better than we're seeing here recently, but do often have lower starting salaries than we see in our small animal colleagues, right? So looking at that companion animal exclusive or predominant, those blue lines up there, seeing that those salaries are quite a bit higher. As we touched on earlier, those with the highest DIR is the student debt to income ratio, often looking at, many of the private schools, some of those more expensive schools, but those lower numbers are more so looking at those that apply to where they're able to be like a resident of. So if you're a resident of California, Davis would be where you can get an in-state tuition seat as a one example. Those that attend the public schools tend to have lower student debt to income ratios, For myself, like I said, I applied to University of Georgia because I was able to get what they call a contract seat. I was able to pay in-state tuition at that school based on my state of residency. Looking at distribution of debt across the way here, right? So again, this graph is from just this past year, seeing that 18% of the graduates graduated across the nation without student debt, but then seeing that those numbers can really vary, right? You're smart people, you're planning to go to vet school, we understand what averages are. When we look at, the average student debt having been $179,000 in this most recent study, we know that some people are going to be less, some people are going to be higher. 1 in 3 graduates are going to be above the $200,000 range. When we look at race across student debt levels, we'll see that there's also quite a bit of variation there, right? So definitely something to keep in mind, something that I do think has been improving over the last couple of years, but something to be aware of. So what we call this is apply smarter, right? Apply to the schools with the lowest cost to you in order to increase the return on your investment. Because ultimately going to vet school, having that education for yourself and having this career is an investment on yourself. And you want to have, a good return on that investment. That's a lot of what we discuss on Vet School Bound and these apply smarter resources. So what's some of the things that we should know, right? We're applying to vet school. We're looking at the AAVMC supported by VEMCAS, right? So the VEMCAS is going to be the Veterinary College Application Service. It's going to be the application portal to most vet schools. The vet schools in Texas don't use VEMCAS. Each of the schools, then many of them also have a supplemental application in addition to the VEMCAS, right? So you would fill out VEMCAS, select which schools you want to apply to, but then be aware and ask if there's and you can often find it on their website, if there's a supplemental second application that would go directly to the vet school. And start thinking about, thinking beyond transcripts, letters of recommendation, things like that, and start looking at where you're going to have the best odds of getting in and where it's going to cost you the least. I saw a question about tips about the personal statement, things to avoid saying. That's a great question. I actually mentioned this when we talk a little bit about interviews a little bit later on, but I do think one of the things, and I think Dr. Bartels has been able to join us, so definitely chime in if you've got any advice for those personal statements as well. I think many of the admissions committees are going to want to see that you've made the decision to go to vet school as an adult, and not just something that you've decided when you were 6, 7, 8 years old, and haven't really explored what it is to be a veterinarian. So definitely with those personal statements, I would encourage you to describe, a story that brought you to veterinary medicine. Like what was a case that you saw or a reason, and why is it that that's the career that you want to have? So when we're looking at increasing your odds of acceptance in general, the state and the public schools are going to admit more in-state residents. So that's going to help to increase your chances of getting in, right? So again, using California as a example, if you're a California resident, UC Davis is going to it reserves more seats for California residents, and so you're going to have a better chance of a better odds of acceptance at that school versus as a out-of-state applicant at other places. We'll look at that a bit here as well. This graph showing the applicants to first year available seats. Again, this is across the nation, right? So looking at data from all of the US vet schools, seeing how those seat numbers have risen and how that applicant to seat ratio has kind of stayed here at about the 2.5, 2.1 range. Now again, we've discussed averages, and some will be higher and some will be lower. So if we look at that across each individual school, a little bit different data here. So this orange bar is showing the resident application to seat ratio, seeing that that's a lower ratio there versus when we start looking at some of those non-resident applicant seat ratios, seeing that some of those get quite quite high, right? And so seeing those opportunities for landing those spots can be a little bit more challenging, making sure that you're a competitive applicant in order to try and secure one of those spots. Got a couple of schools here that we were just going to discuss to illustrate that a little bit more. So again, UC Davis, right? Let's look at the class of 2027 who just started in fall of 2023. So of the California applicants, 24% that applied were offered admission versus 6% of non-residents. So pretty big difference there. Looking at LSU has similar statistics for the class of 2027. So of the Louisiana residents that applied, 34% were admitted versus 3% of the non-residents that applied. Tennessee, 28% of the Tennessee residents versus 2% of the non-residents. Most of the schools will present this information. So again, you can kind of see what this looks like at different schools, right? So when we pull up Louisiana, you can often find this under the admissions tab somewhere. Maybe there will be like a class statistics page, class profile page, something like that, or they'll have the admitted applicant statistics, right? So that we see the Louisiana here presents the last couple of years worth of information, being able to see how many Louisiana residents applied. We can also see they have a contract with Arkansas, being able to see that information if you're an Arkansas resident, and then the other residents, right? Looking at that non-resident information and being able to see how many applicants versus how many people were admitted in those different groups. So again, each of the schools, often you can find this on their website. AAVMC will also have some of this additional information if it's not publicly available on the school's website. You can also reach out to the school if it's not made available on their website. Reach out to the admissions office and ask for some of that information. All right, so then how do we go beyond looking at, we've talked a lot about cost of vet school so far. We've talked a lot about where are your best chances of getting in. So how do we then go beyond that? So reaching out to that dean's office or the admissions office to introduce yourself and ask some of those questions. My biggest advice there is do your homework. If it's a question that is answered on the website, not a great question to ask, right? Instead, we want you to ask questions that you're not able to find that information. So something like, what about scholarship and grant opportunities? Or if you see that information on the website, asking more specific questions about those things. If you do not see the class profile or whatever similar information is there about the residents that apply versus the non-residents that are apply and accepted, where, how can you access that information? Is that made available? And then periodically check in, kind of make a face with a name almost, so that when your application comes across the pile, that you're able to be a little bit of a more competitive applicant. Additionally, there may be other unique ways to increase odds of acceptance. So I've already discussed that I was a contract seat applicant. I was increasing my odds of acceptance by looking at where my application would be looked at maybe a little bit differently, as the fact that I was able to get that contract seat with University of Georgia. What if you're interested in a combined program? There's many programs that are a DVM MBA or a PhD or maybe a Master's of Public Health. If that's a program that you think would be beneficial in your career, do the schools that you're looking at offer those programs? And do those applicants get looked at differently? Is that a different pool versus the at-large pool for either residents or non-residents? Many vet schools offer a vet prep program or an early admissions. You can explore if that's an option at the vet schools that you're looking at attending. So maybe something that, you could start vet school after 2 years of undergrad work, as long as you've satisfied the prereqs and have a certain GPA. Each of those programs varies a little bit differently. And so definitely check those out at the different schools that you might be interested in applying to see what those look like. Got a question here, says, do you recommend asking what the school prefers in their admissions? So example, do they prefer if prereqs are taken in person or virtually? If that's something that's not available on the website, that could be a great question to reach out to the admissions office with. Many times that's often in the FAQs about the prereqs on some of the different schools' websites, may not be available on each one. So that's something that if you're not seeing that information, you could look there. Those requirements did change quite a bit throughout COVID, just because everything was so different, and the schools have been sort of going back to the pre-COVID in various different ways. So when I've been looking across the different schools and communicating with people that have applied to different schools recently, it seems like it's still a little bit all over the place. So that could be something good to reach out. All right, let's talk interviews. Are you like me and you're like, I hate talking to people? Surprisingly, sitting here on this webinar, I actually used to abhor public speaking and did not enjoy talking to people. But ultimately, at the end of the day, vet med is a very people oriented career. We talk a lot with people. We deal with people a lot. We deal with people's emotions and feelings and finances at times. And so we definitely have to learn how to work with people and enjoy that to a point at least. So when we're looking at vet school interviews, definitely be prepared and practice for those. If you're in college now, there may be at your university or college's career center, there may be like a mock interview type situation that's offered. Reach out and see if that's something that's available. Is that something that if you're in a pre-vet club, could your pre-vet club host with some local veterinarians that are willing to act like interviewers? Things like that. So definitely getting that practice down of having those conversations and being able to present yourself in a way that will present you as a competitive applicant. Be prepared for questions like, why do you want to be a veterinarian? And again, loving animals is maybe not enough there, right? Because it is a very people-oriented profession. Every animal that you deal with is gonna come attached to a person. And so enjoying that aspect of it, as well as the medicine of it, really being interested in the science, the math, the medicine behind being a veterinarian, and highlighting those things. Again, is there, a certain case or a situation that happened in your life that sparked that interest in veterinary medicine for you? What does that look like? Anticipate questions about student debt or income, right? They might ask you about, what do you expect to make as a veterinarian, or how much student debt do you think that you're going to accumulate while you're in vet school? Things like that. So definitely anticipate those questions. Some of the other tips that I've got for you are soft skills. So when I was in vet school, I was a part of an organization called VBMA, which is the Veterinary Business Management Association. And we hosted a mock interview workshop each year for the students so that they could prepare for when they're eventually looking for a job and having those interviews. And the number one thing that hiring veterinarians and hiring managers at vet practices would tell me is that they wanted somebody with soft skills, somebody that could have a conversation with a client, could build those relationships with a client and make them feel welcome in the practice, could work well with staff members, other doctors, being able to just have a conversation. So I definitely encourage you to remember that when you're interviewing for vet school, it's not just about getting the right answer and being the most prepared in anticipating those questions, but also being able to just represent who you are as a person. Probably going to be some questions about resiliency. That's a big thing in veterinary medicine right now. Veterinary medicine, it can be a hard career path. And so there's definitely challenging cases that you'll come across. There can be challenging situations with colleagues or staff members, things like that. And so being able to show that resiliency through that you've learned throughout your life so far? What are those skills that you have to cope with things that can be challenging? Vet school can be really challenging, right? So I definitely encourage you to, how have you dealt well with maybe not doing as well as you thought you would in school, or having to manage course loads, because vet school course loads are really challenging, as well as ethics. There's, definitely be prepared for some of those questions as well. There's a number of lists out there. If you look, many of the vet schools will have sample interview questions, and so you can look at those and explore what those might look like. Have questions for them. That's a great one for any time you interview, whether it is for vet school or a job down the line or whatever the case may be. When you will be asked at the interview, do you have any questions for us? And your answer should always be yes, because you should definitely have questions prepared for them. And again, do your homework, right? So it's not questions that are easily answered on the website or anything like that. Have questions that, hey, I saw this, or we discussed this today. What is something related to that you can tell me a little bit more about, right? Be able to show that you've looked into the program, you understand what the expectations are, and have those questions prepared. We've got a couple of blog posts on the VIN Foundation site about preparing for different interview types. So whether it's the panel or the MMI, and so you can check those out. Again, we'll record this, we'll have this presentation available for you as well. And so you'll be able to click on these links and explore those. All right, let's see, we got a couple of questions here. Is there a special program, admissions requirements, or procedures for students who are already studying vet med in a country outside of the AVMA and later considering vet med in the US? Yeah, so it sounds like if you are attending a vet school outside of the US and are you planning to study vet med and attend vet school in the US, or are you planning to practice in the US? For those that have done education outside of the US and then are planning to come to the US for vet school, you can check and see with the admissions committee for each of those schools what those programs are. If you're looking to do vet school outside of the US and then practice within the state, a couple of different options. It depends on if you're attending a AVMA accredited vet school. So the AVMA is the American Veterinary Medical Association. They work with AAVMC to accredit each of the vet schools. And so there are schools outside of the US, example, the Caribbean schools like Ross and St. George's, that are considered AVMA accredited. Those schools, if they are AVMA accredited, you pass NAVLE, which is the national licensing exam that you take towards the end of vet school, then you're able to practice in the US if you are, licensed by the state. If you attend a non-AVMA accredited vet school outside of the US, there's a couple of different pathways for them being able to practice within the US. There's 2 different pathways, and so we can share some additional information about that. I was like, Jordan, do we have a blog post about that maybe? I can't remember. Either the ECFCG or the PAVE program. They're 2 different programs that basically have you complete certain qualifications. The 2 programs differ a little bit from each other in order to be able to be licensed in the US. So
yeah, I don't think we have a blog post about that. We do have a couple blog posts about MMIs, like interviews, like a couple different interview styles. So I can put a link to those blog posts, and then everybody that registered for this webinar will get an email with the link to the recording and the presentation links. And then we'll also put the links in that email as well.
Great, thank you. All right, so a little quiz there. Where are you applying to vet school and why? Will you need student loans to pay for your education? How much does that school cost, and what does that interest look like? does student debt stress you out, right? If you borrow a large amount of student debt and you end up on that $300,000, $400,000 side of having those averages at the time of graduation, is that going to make you panic? Dr. Bartels and I see that all the time on the message boards, unfortunately, of, oh my gosh, I have so much of this student debt and I feel like I just need to get out from under it and I don't know how to do that. And I've forsaken, life and other areas of my finances because I am so stressed out about this student debt. So being able to understand what does that look like for you? Is there a discounted tuition rate for you? Yes, the answer is yes. We'll dive a bit into that as well. Look at living expenses across the different schools. So really just what do these things look like for you? And based on the decisions that you want to make about where you're going to go to vet school. So as I mentioned, one of the resources that VIN Foundation has is our Vet School Bound website, which is dedicated for those who want to go to vet school. You've made that decision that yes, vet med is for me. This is what I want to do. And so this Vet School Bound website is really focused on helping you to understand that and answer those questions. So for example, this is our Apply Smarter to Vet School page. So discussing a lot of the things that we've talked about today. And again, you'll see those links to some of those different blog posts and resources, some of the data sets that we've discussed today, but what does that look like for you? We've also been doing a series of updates on this website, so I definitely appreciate any feedback that you have. Feel free to let us know. We've been trying to gather a lot of the different resources that are out there across the different vet school websites and put it all in one place. So for example, what are my chances of getting into vet school? And so you can see here, we've got for each of the different schools, we've gone through and gathered that information as we've been able to find it and keep it updated about how many resident applications versus non-resident applications were submitted versus how many people were accepted, and being able to see sort of what are those chances of getting in to some of the different vet schools. Another new update that we've done recently is our cost of education toolkit. So if you're familiar with the cost of education map that we've had before, that's still available here, but is no longer being updated. And so we're now working on this cost of education toolkit to explore some of those different things. And so this information is gathered from the different schools, looking at what are the tuition costs, the living expense costs, that overall cost of attendance, adding those two things together, and what does it cost for you to go to some of these different vet schools. So you can explore on this map, as well as we have the cost of education tool, which will show you some similar information, and then the school rankings by cost. So looking at, okay, if I were looking at resident costs, what do the different schools cost? For many of us, we have limited resident seats that we can attend, but looking at some of this non-resident information, looking at some of the more expensive to the least expensive schools and being able to see what that looks like. The map's really interesting because you can select some of the different schools. So for example, if we wanted to look at Colorado, and being able to explore what does it look like for cost of attendance at Colorado State University, right? So this is a 4-year program. We see tuition, living expenses, that total cost of attendance, as well as that total cost of attendance plus accrued interest, right? We kind of touched a little bit on that earlier, and we'll dive more into that here in a bit about when you start borrowing for vet school, you start accruing interest at that time, right? So for example, some of the student loans that you could accept right now have a 7.05% interest rate. And so those loans that you take are accruing 7% interest from the time that you borrow. And so that, as you can see here, that accrued interest can add up over time while you're in school beyond just what the cost of attendance is. One of the other unique things that we have here is the with estimated increase. So tuition costs and things don't stay the same over time. Those tuition costs do go up, as you may have already seen with your undergrad education. And so the cost of education tool here will look at what is the average increase for each school over the last couple of years and apply that estimated increase, right? So that we see Colorado State here, for example, has about an average of 1.6% increase over time, and being able to apply that to the tuition and see how that could change over time. Again, that's an estimated increase, right? Might be a little bit different, but that is based on historical data from each school. Same for non-resident information for Colorado State there. And we can also explore some of the other schools. So let's say if we wanted to look at Illinois. Again, 4-year program, looking at those different costs over time. And we see the University of Illinois, an estimated 2.3% increase over time, right? So being able to start exploring some of those different things. If maybe you're not planning to borrow the full amount because of any variety of reasons, then you can see how that might change this as well. We have a in-school loan estimator tool, which I can show you right here, and it'll help you to see some of that information as well. You can tell where I go all the time. So this tool can also help you to explore what it looks like to borrow for vet school. So say that you're going to attend a school, whether you're looking at a resident or non-resident rate, when you plan to start school. And then you can input that estimated borrowing and generate sort of a profile here of what you think that would cost. You can use this click to fill in estimates. We're working on getting that updated as well, and then be able to see sort of what borrowing looks like for you throughout vet school, right? What do some of those costs look like? What does interest look like as it could grow over time, as well as that in-school interest? So a ton of different tools available there. One of the other things that you'll see here is for those schools, like for example, if you select Alaska and explore what's available there, you'll see that there's University of Alaska Fairbanks. This school actually has one of those combined programs, so a 2+2 program. So, and you'll see that information here. This school is a 2+2 program with Colorado State University. So if you were a Alaska resident interested in applying to this program, you do the first 2 years of vet school at University of Alaska Fairbanks, and then move to Colorado State for those last 2 years of school. So some of those different unique programs that could be beneficial to you as you're applying to vet school. And does that change your chances of getting in if you're looking at some of these 2+2 programs? Another similar one, let's see here. Another similar one here, looking at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. This school is a 2+2 program with University of Iowa. So if you're a Nebraska resident, does that increase your chances of being accepted to vet school if you're applying to one of these programs? Something to reach out, and if that information is not available, reach out to the admissions office and start inquiring about those things. So again, remember, school choice is the most significant factor in explaining the variations in student debt, but not where you attend a school is not as much of an impact on how much money you make after vet school, what your anticipated income would be as a new graduate veterinarian, right? Going to the more expensive schools doesn't necessarily guarantee you a higher income. We can see that here. This is a little bit older data that I haven't been able to track down the updated version of, but still really explains that concept, right? So looking at the public schools, the resident tuition rate at those public schools, resulting in the lower amount of student debt. versus you see a little bit of an increase here with the non-resident rate, and then looking at those private schools, starting to see that increase over time. This is the first time that we've seen some of the information about the Caribbean schools. We do see that those schools do often result in an even higher amount of student debt over the course of your vet school time. There's a couple of different reasons about that, and we'll touch on that here in a second as well. So when looking at cost and looking at your best chances of getting in, starting with your in-school option, right? Or where you have the option to obtain a discounted tuition rate. So there's similar programs. So again, as a University of Georgia graduate, my contract seat was through the SREB, the Southern Regional Education Board. Because as a Delaware resident, there was not a vet school for me in my state. And I was able to get that discounted, that contract seat at University of Georgia because of this program. There's a number of schools in the southeast region of the US that participate in that program. Similar program out in the western US, WICHE, and being able to see if there's a program for your state of residence that falls within that program. We've touched on a number of those 2+2 programs. Might be a 1+3 program, but those schools where you would complete the first years of your education at one place and then transfer to another vet school to finish up at that program. Those are preset programs, so it's not like you can just choose to start your education in your home state for vet school and then switch to a different vet school. Those do have to be those pre-existing programs. I mentioned earlier that everyone has an option for a discounted seat at a vet school. So if you live in a state that does not have a vet school and does not have a contract, there's still options for where you can have a lower cost of tuition, a discounted tuition rate at some of these schools. So University of Missouri, NC State, Ohio State, UC Davis, and Washington State all have programs where you are able to change your state of residency after you start vet school. So usually you would complete the first year, you would pay an out-of-state tuition rate, and then be able to change your state of residency to that state and pay in-state tuition for the next 3 years. That can be a great way to help bring those costs lower because you're not paying out-of-state tuition for all 4 years. Texas A&M has a similar program. It's actually based on, I think it's your GPA that it's based on. And so if you maintain a certain GPA, then you can obtain in-state tuition at Texas A&M after the first year. So some of those programs can be really, really helpful, especially depending on maybe where either you have no in-state option or contract based on your state of residency, right? You could definitely look at some of these places because it may end up being less expensive for you to attend those schools versus some of your out-of-state at-large seat options, or depending on what your state of residence is and what your in-state option is. These could be really good backup options if you're looking at where you want to apply, looking at low, reduce bringing down that list of target schools from every single school to a more reasonable number of schools that you would want to apply to. I see a question here about when reapplying, most schools don't do individual feedback. Should I be looking to change my application, personal essays, getting more varied experience? Yeah, so that's a great question. If one of the schools that you apply to will do a review, that's a great way to get feedback. I know not all schools do that, but even if just one of the schools that you've applied to does that, that could be really a really good opportunity to just get that individualized feedback about this is what we thought, this is what would work to help to strengthen your application. Honestly, that question is a little bit dependent on a personal level, just because it depends on what is it your GPA that maybe could use some improvement? Do you need more experience hours? Do you need more diverse experience? For example, most of the admissions committees are looking to see, have you gotten veterinary experience hours in a number of different types of practice, or have you solely had experience at one single practice and not been able to explore what it is to be a veterinarian in general, and getting a good idea of that overall career path. I know many of us, I myself included, went into vet school and was pretty convinced that I was going to do, this one thing. I was convinced that I was going to do regulatory medicine and horse racing. I wanted to take the people that broke the rules in horse racing, and I wanted to tell them they had messed up, and I really didn't want anybody to like me. And then somehow I ended up here working with VIN and VIN Foundation, and I do a lot of student debt education. I do a lot of student outreach, a lot of working with vet students and veterinarians, and helping them in their careers. Definitely wasn't on my bingo card when I went to vet school, right? You never know what you might find that you're interested in over the course of vet school, over the course of your career. And so really making sure that, you've chose veterinary medicine, you've chose going to vet school, and not just a specific niche area. Along that line, I haven't seen it come up in the questions, surprisingly enough, but I know that another common question that comes up from pre-vets is, well, I want to be a exotics veterinarian, I want to do wildlife, or whatever the case may be. And that means I need to go to a specific program for vet school that focuses in those things. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. The goal of vet school is to teach you to be a veterinarian. Each of the AVMA accredited schools are going to teach you same type of information. The goal is to get you out the door as a general practitioner, to be able to pass your boards exam, and to be able to, be a practicing veterinarian. If you're looking to specialize in certain areas of veterinary medicine, whether that be zoo med, whether that be surgery, or if you want to be an oncologist, each of those specializations come after vet school, right? Then you're looking at an internship and a residency. And where you do those things tends to have more of an impact on those specific areas of your career that you want to go into than where you attended vet school. So, I always worry when I have pre-vets who say, like, I want to go into this specific area of veterinary medicine, and so I need to go to a school that specializes in that, because there's so much that you could do in your career. You don't know how what's going to catch your interest while you're in vet school. So I do hesitate to recommend that you base your decision of where to go to vet school on those things. I see another question here. Is there a chance to get into vet school if I failed a chemistry course? So again, depends on some specifics. Is that a course that you've retaken? What is the reason that you failed chemistry? Veterinary medicine is really dependent on science, math, all of those things. So being able to have a strong foundation in those core classes, those prerequisite classes, is really important. But many of the admissions committees, many of the vet schools do understand that things happen, and is there a reason? Again, I could use myself as a case example. When I first started college, I was not a very good student. My transcript the first year looked really rough. And that was because it was a big adjustment for me moving from home to college. It definitely was a case of I needed to do a little bit more growing up. I needed to get some more experience in the world. And so I actually took a very winding path through my undergrad degree. And it was clear to see to the admissions committee that when I had taken that time away from school, came back to finish my degree, that I had done a lot of maturing, done a lot of growing up. And at that point, I was then much more focused on my studies and being able to go to vet school. So for me, that was how my situation worked out. You know, failing one class doesn't mean that you absolutely will not get into vet school, but I do really want you to take a look at why that happened and what steps have you taken to make sure that that doesn't happen again, and that you're prepared for the course load of vet school. All right. So for those of you that did start off with, I already have student loans, borrowing for vet school is different than borrowing for undergrad. And so it's a little bit of a different beast, a little bit of different rules. And so for those of you that haven't borrowed already and would be new to learning how to pay for vet school through student loans, don't stress about that. Everybody's kind of starting from a new understanding. And so when you go to vet school, you're eligible to borrow up to the cost of attendance established by your program, right? So each vet school will say each year, this is how much it costs to attend our vet school based on tuition, fees, living expenses. Do you have to buy certain things for that school? So for example, do you need like a specific tablet at some of the programs or a laptop? That cost of attendance is what dictates how much you can borrow of US federal student loans. You want to start first with the direct unsubsidized loans. These loans have annual limits based on your program type. So vet school isn't always a traditional, August to May academic year. It depends on the school you go to, and it depends on which year in school you are. So many of you might know that during the later part of vet school, you're on clinics, right? So you're not just sitting in the classroom learning, you're actually on rotations at the teaching hospital or doing those rotations outside of the school, depending on the program that you go to. And so those might be longer times in school. So it might be a full 12-month versus like a 9 or a 10-month year in school. And so those direct unsubsidized loans, how much you can take each year depends on that program. The other thing that is important to mention here is that the maximum cap that you can take out in those direct unsubsidized loans per year is dependent on where your school is in the accreditation. So if it's an AVMA accredited US school, those unsubsidized loan amounts is capped at a higher amount. It's capped at, for a traditional kind of like 9-month term, it's $40,500 that you can borrow in those unsubsidized loans. If you go to a foreign AVMA accredited school, so outside of the US, that cap for the unsubsidized loans is actually lower. It's down to $20,500, right? So you're getting pushed into the next category of borrowing that much sooner at those other schools outside of the US. As long as they're AVMA accredited, you can still borrow US federal student loans to pay for your vet school that way. That's important because the direct unsubsidized loans have a lower interest rate than some of the other loan types. So once you maximize that direct unsubsidized loan amount, if you still need to borrow more money to pay for school that year, to pay for your living expenses that year, then you're looking at then moving on to the direct Grad Plus loan. That's unlimited based up to the cost of attendance, right? So it's not unlimited to the ends of the earth, but it is limited to the cost of attendance established by your school. So really easy numbers, right? If your cost of attendance that year is going to be $80,000, you can borrow $40,500 in those unsubsidized loans, and then that remaining amount would be in Grad Plus loans. The Grad Plus loans have higher interest rates and fees than the direct unsubsidized loans. So that's why I say I want you to maximize that unsubsidized loan amount before you move to the Grad Plus, because that will help to keep your overall borrowing costs lower throughout vet school. Both of those loan types accrue interest as soon as you receive them, right? So we touched on that earlier. If I am starting vet school this fall, as soon as I get that disbursement of loans, my loans will start accruing interest based on the interest rates of those loans. And that goes on throughout school. So by maximizing that lower cost, unsubsidized loan amount before moving on to the higher Grad Plus loans, you're able to help keep those borrowing costs down throughout school as well. We always get questions about in-school payments, especially for interest. Should I borrow more this year so I can pay off the interest that I accumulated last year? And my answer is usually no for that. I don't want you to take money later on in vet school that's more expensive money, higher interest rates, to pay off lower interest rate loans from earlier in vet school. Instead of doing that, it's always better to borrow less. Vet school is different from undergrad in that you're considered independent of your parents. And so that allows you to borrow up to your cost of attendance. There are some subsidized loan amounts that are available. These are the health profession student loans or the loans for disadvantaged students. Those are dependent on your family finances and are not available at all vet school. So these two loan types usually it's the state schools where you're going to see those, and you do have to submit your parents' financial information in order to see if you're eligible for those. But if you are able to receive either the health profession student loans or the loans for disadvantaged students, do encourage you to take those and take those first. The reason is those are what we call subsidized loans. That means that throughout school, your interest is subsidized. It's covered by the government, and you don't have that interest from those loan types doesn't accrue during school as it would with those direct loan types. The other reason I like those is because they have a 5% interest rate for the life of the loan, which is lower than we're seeing for the direct loan type. So again, just really making good decisions about which loans do I want to take first, knowing how much that maximum is for your direct unsubsidized loan so that you can double check that information, and just being able to keep your borrowing costs lower throughout school. That's actually something that we call borrow better. So again, like I said, VIN Foundation really has a ton of resources available throughout the entire veterinary career. And so our borrow better resources focus on borrowing while you're in school, making these good decisions, understanding that. And so if you're watching this webinar and you know that you're headed to vet school, you've already been accepted, or you get your acceptance letter soon after this, and you're wondering what borrowing during vet school looks like, I definitely encourage you to explore these borrow better resources. The other reason that we recommend federal student loans for paying for vet school is because they're the most flexible during repayment. As I said, I myself am using one of these income-driven repayment plans to repay my student loans. These plans they base your payment on your income. So the more you make, the more your payment is. It's, if my income decreases for any reason, if I'm out of work, if I get hurt, whatever the case may be, I can adjust my monthly student loan payment based on that. And there's also some other programs that exist. One of them is called public service loan forgiveness, which if you go into a type of work that is considered public service, so for a 501c3 nonprofit, if you do government work, if you work in academia, you want to be a specialist and work in a vet school, the public service loan forgiveness program has some additional benefits in which you would repay your student loans while working in one of those jobs and reach student loan forgiveness sooner, helping to keep your repayment costs lower. That's a ways away for you all, right? We haven't gotten to vet school, we haven't started borrowing, we certainly haven't started with repayment yet. But I do want you to know there are some flexibilities for those federal student loans. There's some safety nets for those federal student loans as well. None of your family members are ever on the hook for those loans should you unfortunately pass away before you repay those student loans to zero. They would go away with you if you were to die, or potentially if there's some disability clauses as well. And so again, just those safety nets, because we've talked about it, paying for vet school can be really expensive and those numbers can add up pretty quickly. And so you never want your family to be on the hook for those. And so that's why we recommend the federal student loans. There's just the safety nets built in, the flexibilities of repayment built in can be really, really beneficial.
Becca, we've got a question here that's relevant to that last slide, which was,
let's see.
If you pull out all unsubsidized loans and realize later you need Grad Plus loans, can you pull those out, or do you just have to hope for the best?
Yes. Okay. Great question. So if you borrow and realize that you need more money during that semester, you can edit your student loan award. So each semester they're going to say this is how much money that you've received based on when you apply for federal student loans, you use the FAFSA. So based on your FAFSA, this is how much you qualify for. If you say, I don't need that full amount, and you only borrow your unsubsidized loan amount, and then realize you need additional money, you can then take out additional Grad Plus loans as well later on in the semester. Yeah, that's a great question. So if you need more, you can borrow more. And again, those Grad Plus loans, by focusing primarily on your unsubsidized loans, if that's able to cover your costs, fantastic. If you need those Grad Plus loans, they're not a bad loan type at all. I just like for you all to maximize that unsubsidized loan borrowing first. So yeah, great question. No problem. All right. So other types of support that might happen in vet school, depending on your life, maybe you've got family members, whether it's mom, dad, uncle, grandparent, whatever the case may be, that wants to help pay for vet school. Maybe they've indicated to you that, if you get into vet school, when you walk across that stage, they're going to give you a big fat check. Well, hit the button on that and have a conversation, because honestly, family support is better applied up front rather than after school. I'd much rather you, use that to pay for tuition versus repaying your loans after the fact. The reason is that's going to help to reduce the amount of interest that you accrue during in school, right? So if you can have that family member support applied during your first year, then you're not borrowing student loans that are going to start accruing interest at that time. So that can be helpful. There's also some more favorable consequences for your family by paying tuition versus paying student loans. So that can factor into that decision as well. Again, avoid those in-school interest payments. I don't want to see you use family money to pay for in-school interest. I'd rather you just have to borrow less during the year by having that money applied up front. Private and non-federal loans. I hesitate to find a reason that you should ever need private loans to pay for vet school, just because you can use those federal student loans to borrow up to the cost of attendance. So it's really hard for me to find a use case scenario in which that would be necessary. I saw a question in the chat about, are government loans hard to get without a cosigner? So you do not need, as a vet school student, because you are considered independent of your family and because those federal student loans do not depend on a credit check or anything like that, you don't need a cosigner for federal student loans. So again, another reason why we want you to use federal student loans, not private loans, in order to pay for vet school. If you already have, student loan debt or something like that, then you are still able to get up to the cost of attendance in those federal student loans. All right, so a couple of take-home points, right? There was some information presented a couple of years ago by AAVMC, which said that the cost of applying was the biggest driver for where and how many schools pre-vet students would apply to. That cost of attendance wasn't a deciding factor until they already had an offer of admission. That's a little challenging, right? It's really hard. Trust me, I did it. It's really challenging to look at a vet school that's saying, hey, you can come here, we've admitted you, and say, no, I'm not going to take that because I'm now thinking about cost, right? So set yourself up for success and apply to the schools that you would actually attend, right? Start looking at that cost of attendance now while you're, applying this year, or while you're starting to look at which prereqs you need to take and narrowing down your target list of schools. Really start thinking about those things now, right? And the other reason is it helps save you money on your VMCAS application as well. If you're applying to 15 schools just because you want to get into vet school and then making decisions after the fact about, well, no, I couldn't actually go there because of the cost, you could have saved yourself the money on the VMCAS by not applying to that many schools, right? So start thinking about those things now in order to make those best decisions. this data had said that on average, the applicants were applying to 5 vet schools. You know, that can add up pretty quickly, right? So that could be over $1,500 just to apply by the time that you look at FEMCAS, by the time you look at those supplemental applications, usually have fees as well. Do those schools require any sort of additional tests? Many of the schools have done away with the GRE requirement, which has been helpful in bringing down the total cost of applying to vet school, but many schools do require CAFR, which is another type of test that you might have to take for some of the vet schools. It may be a requirement, and there's costs associated with that. So really the cost of applying to vet school can add up pretty quickly. So again, by making those good decisions about where you want to apply, where you would actually go to school, where you would accept, those can help you to kind of bring down that cost as well. How much should I borrow from vet school, and what should I factor in when thinking about the right amount of student loans to take out? Really, that's really that borrow better concept that I've linked to and that we discuss all the time with veterinary students. Dr. Bartels does a great job of being a part of some of the vet school curriculum and speaking at vet schools as part of the coursework to help those veterinary students understand those things, making good choices about prioritizing your unsubsidized loan borrowing before moving on to Grad Plus loan borrowing, understanding, does your school offer health profession student loans or loans for disadvantaged students, especially if cost is on your mind and you know that that's something that you would likely qualify for. Do the schools that you're applying offer those things? We talked about students all the time, and one of the questions that we ask them is, how much are you going to pay towards your student loans after you graduate vet school? And I actually just averaged this up before this talk from the last couple of vet student lectures that we've done, and the average turned out to be about $1,350 per month is what students are expecting to pay when they graduate. That's a pretty big amount of what is likely going to be your take-home income as a new graduate veterinarian, especially if you're looking at doing an internship or a residency where you're really making limited income while you're doing that additional training. You know, say you want to be a surgeon, an oncologist, a zoo vet, whatever the case may be. And so really that $1,300 a month is a challenging number for many new graduate veterinarians. Additionally, when you look at the repayment options that are available to those student loans, so if you're looking at a time-driven repayment plan, so repaying your student loans within 10 years after you graduate vet school, if you're looking at an average of a 6.5% interest rate, that's suggesting that you're only borrowing about $119,000 to pay for student debt or for vet school. We've looked at a lot of the numbers across both national averages as well as averages across the different schools. There's not many schools in which there's a number of graduates that are graduating with $119,000 student loans or less, right? So that when you're looking at those time-driven plans and looking at repaying that balance to zero within 10 years, it's not reflecting what we're actually seeing vet students borrow to pay for school. When you're looking at an income-driven plan that would base your monthly payment after you graduate vet school on your income, then a $1,300 per month payment is suggesting that new graduate veterinarian is making $196,000 or more. Not seeing too many of those jobs available. If you find a job that's paying you almost $200,000 as a new graduate, let me know. Maybe I could have another career change. I'm kidding, Jordan. So it's really not
funny. Not funny.
It's really not. We're not seeing that. We're not seeing that using an income-driven repayment plan that new graduate veterinarians are having to pay that amount of money for their student loans. Again, a ways away at this point in your career and your potential hopeful veterinarian career from repayment, but just things to know and be aware of when you're looking at applying to vet school and starting to factor in what does it cost you for your education. We've talked about it. Student debt's stressful, right? So start thinking about those education costs now before you submit your application, before you decide where you're going to apply to vet school. Don't try and tempt yourself to pay more than you have to in order to become a veterinarian, right? Every AVMA accredited vet school is going to allow you to become a veterinarian, assuming you pass all your classes and you walk across that stage. To be a veterinarian, it doesn't mean that you have to go to the quote unquote best vet school. Again, the best vet school that for you is the one you get into and the one that costs you least. Once you're admitted into school, and I see this all the time, once you start school, there's only so much that you can do about borrowing, right? Again, that borrow better concept, we dive into what does that look like to pay for vet school and how can you impact that number. But your ability to impact how much you borrow throughout vet school really becomes a lot more limited once you start school. So think about that now, right? What are the schools that you're looking at? What do they cost? And making those decisions about where you're going to hit that submit button for based on including that as part of your decision making. And it's always easier to manage less debt than more, right? So we see this all the time about new graduate veterinarians or veterinarians that have been a couple of years out in practice, and they're just like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do with this. I just kept hitting accept the total amount each time, and now time has come for repayment, and I don't know what to do. So try and keep that student debt lower throughout your education. I tell people all the time, vet school is 4 years. Student loan repayment can often be 20 to 25 years. So make those informed decisions about where you're thinking about applying. I see it all the time from students that have applied to vet school and are now accepted as well about, I'm supposed to be at vet school in 30 days and I just don't know how I'm going to pay for this. And, I accepted somewhere that's really expensive because I thought that was the best school for me. And didn't accept my in-state offer and really seeing that panic start to set in. So I do encourage where you all are now in your process of, potentially hopeful future veterinarians to start thinking about those things, be a little bit better informed than some of your colleagues are. Here's some of our great resources, right? So a lot about applying to vet school, many of the resources about cost and finances, as well as income and economics. All of these, again, we'll send out the Prezi as well as the recording of this webinar, and all of those things are linked here so that you can explore some of those resources. And with that, let's revisit some of our questions. All right, so can you show us an example of entering experience into VEMCAS, like volunteer hours versus working with a veterinarian? I can't show you VEMCAS. I don't think they have a demo or anything available. But breaking down volunteer hours versus hours with a veterinarian depends on what you were doing that time. So veterinarian hours are defined as those that are under direct supervision of a veterinarian versus those volunteer hours. It depends on what you were doing during that time. So if you were volunteering and you were under the direct supervision of a veterinarian, then those would be considered veterinary experience hours versus other non-veterinary related volunteer time, right? That might fall under animal experience if it was something like that, or just general volunteer that wasn't related to animals or vet med at all. So that's kind of how that breaks down, but unfortunately I can't show that to you. The VEMCAS group does a number of webinars as well, and they usually have a pretty good Q&A during those. And so you would be able to, I definitely encourage you, go to aavmc.org. And I think there's some links on there to include those webinars, and you can jump on one of those and ask those questions. Holistic versus traditional veterinary schools, what are the differences? I'm not too familiar with this. I know that so as far as the veterinary schools themselves, there's some schools that do holistic applications. And so those holistic application cycles tend to focus on your overall application more than just specific things. So for example, a lot of times I'll see those that have GPA concerns, really focusing on those holistic applications. That's not something I'm too familiar with. So that would be something to reach out to the admissions office and discuss more with them about when it's a holistic application, what does that look like? As far as being a holistic versus traditional veterinary school, I'm not familiar with that at all. That's not something I've heard. When we talk tradition, oftentimes when I hear traditional veterinary schools, what that's referring to is a veterinary school with a teaching hospital. And so you're able to do your entire veterinary education, you do your didactic as well as your clinical work at that school. You do your clinical rotations through their teaching hospital. Many of those schools also give you externship opportunities where you can do some of those clinical rotations elsewhere. So, for example, when I did my clinical rotations at a traditional school at UGA, I did those rotations mostly at the teaching hospital, but then I did have a number of weeks that I was able to go elsewhere, which is an externship, and be able to do experiences at private practices, other schools, something like that. The comparison to traditional veterinary schools would then be the distributive model schools. So that would be something like Lincoln Memorial University has been around for a number of years and has a distributive model, Long Island. So that's a school that does not have its own teaching hospital there. So you would do your didactic learning, the labs, things like that at your school. And then during that clinical year, whether it's a year, however long it is, you are doing those rotations at different, usually they're approved sites that are contracted with the schools. And so you would cycle through those, and those can be either at different clinical practices, they might be at a shelter medicine place, they might be a pathology rotation somewhere, like a diagnostic lab. So those programs are a little bit different in that they do not have a dedicated teaching hospital at that school. As a veterinary graduate in Nigeria, how do I apply for a job in the US? Yeah, so that would be, we discussed it earlier about there's two different programs for those veterinarians that have attended a non-AVMA accredited school that want to practice in the state. And so you would have to participate in one of those two programs in order to complete the licensing requirements to be able to do that and apply for and be approved by the boards. Will a low GPA ruin my chances of getting in? I've got a 3.2 overall and a 3.8 science GPA. Again, depends on your overall application and how competitive you are as a applicant. So you can look at the schools that you're targeting, and a lot of times you'll be able to see what is the average GPA of an admitted student or of the students that applied to that school, and you can compare, how do you factor up against that. But it's not just your GPA. I will say that a lot of the admissions committees are doing a really good job of understanding that it's not just grades that go into becoming a veterinarian. Grades are a very important part. Many of the schools will tell you that GPA is the best indicator of overall academic performance in vet school. That's why they look at GPA so heavily, because that helps to indicate, are you going to be successful in the program or not? Other things that would factor into that is your course load, right? Were you taking very heavy course loads and your GPA as a result of that? Was there something going on in life during that time? Did a family member get sick or something like that that impacted that GPA? You may need to retake some classes in order to boost your GPA. And then looking at the things beyond GPA, right? What are your extracurriculars? What are your leadership skills? Your letters of recommendation. Having really strong letters of recommendation are very, very important when applying to vet school, because those are individuals that know you well and can recommend you to becoming a veterinarian, as well as your veterinary experience hours. Having a number of diverse hours in vet med shadowing is really important. That could be paid or not paid. Most of the schools will tell you they don't look at the paid versus not paid veterinary hours any differently, just as long as there are quality experiences where you're learning about the profession. Are there resources to study and help with the CASPER? There are. I can't list any of them offhand. I was actually just looking into this. And so, yes, there are some resources that'll help. There's a number of like YouTube videos and prep programs and whatnot. If you just like, honestly, Google CASPER prep and go to the CASPER website, and they have some additional resources to prepare for that. This is a good question. What do you think about the veterinary medicine loan repayment program for shortage areas from the USDA? Yeah, great question. So the VMLRP, the Veterinary Medicine Loan Repayment Program, is a specific program that once you've graduated vet school, there are certain neat areas that are designed as or designated as there's a certain need for a veterinarian in those areas. They're often rural areas where there's a limited number of veterinarians, especially for certain species. So some of the areas that I've practiced in, they were for small ruminant veterinarians. You had to do a certain percentage of small ruminant work in order to qualify for those. If you do qualify for those, you apply and you're approved, that program will pay up $25,000 for 3 years in a row, $75,000 towards your student loans. General rule of thumb is if that's what you want to do with your career, is you want to practice rural medicine and you want to practice on those species that are needed in that area, then yeah, absolutely. I mean, apply for it if you get approved. I don't know that it's necessarily something to hang your hat on and base your career decisions on by getting that grant. You know, a lot of times, unfortunately, some of the reasons that there are veterinarians needed in those areas is because they are lower paying jobs. Maybe you can't make as much as a veterinarian. And so I don't recommend that you pursue that area of veterinary medicine and that career path solely based on the fact that you would hopefully apply and be approved for that repayment plan, just because it can have some impact on your overall finances. You know, if that's what you want to do, great, apply for it. The other thing with those programs is that is considered taxable income, so it increases your taxable income, which when using an income-driven repayment plan is what your payment's calculated on. So it's a little bit backwards in that what is supposed to help you with your student loan repayment is actually driving up your own then monthly payment. And so those can be a little bit conflicting. One of the resources that we have that's really awesome, and I can't believe I forgot to mention it, is the Apply Smarter message board. So VIN, the Veterinary Information Network, is a community of veterinarians and vet students. There's over 100,000 members worldwide. And there's a special area on there for VIN Foundation access. It's free. We just ask that you create a login and a password, and you can go on the message board and ask some of these questions. And that's a great one that we can explore in more detail there about what does the veterinary medicine loan repayment program look like, and how does that impact repaying student loans? Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely encourage you, if you've got questions about, you know, veterinary experience or what it's like to be a veterinarian, anything like that, I definitely encourage you to use that message board, because like I said, it's over 100,000 veterinarians and vet students worldwide that can chime in and help answer your questions. So it's a really great resource. How do I make up for only having experience in one clinic? It's in a small animal, but sees exotics as well, some emergency cases. I have equine experience from my barn and have experience with equine vets with that. Is that sufficient? Yeah, so that's some pretty, you know, at least you've got some small animal and you've got some equine experience as well. So you've at least got two different types and some exotics experience as well. So yeah, you're working on getting some really good diverse experience there. You know, if there's a mixed large animal vet in your area that you could shadow, that'd be great. One of the other things, another experience type that would be good is research. So if you haven't done any research experience, that could be another really great way to diversify your experience. And then potentially a second small, you know, an additional small animal clinic. Being able to see small animal medicine from different points of view, being able to see those different clinic types as well. If I work solely in GP, would you recommend experience in large animal before applying? Yes, I do recommend diverse veterinary experience. So like we were just discussing with that last question, having small animal, large animal, equine, research experience, all of those are really, really encouraged. Again, the admissions committees, they really like to see that you have explored what it is to be a veterinarian, right? Because there's so much that can be done as a veterinarian beyond traditional clinical practice and what we might think of as being a veterinarian. So definitely exploring those different things, getting a good feel for what different aspects of veterinary medicine are there, right? There's veterinarians that are in food safety. There's veterinarians that are in research, One Health. There's so many things that you can do as a veterinarian. And so being able to explore those different types of experience is really important to being a competitive applicant. Okay. Any advice for any advice for students that have gotten a later start on deciding to go pre-vet in their college career? Yes, welcome. That was me as well. I took a very roundabout path through undergrad. I was insistent until I was about 26 that I would never become a veterinarian. One of the biggest things that can be really challenging as a non-traditional student, depending on what your experiences are and everything, is getting those veterinary hours. As somebody that's a non-traditional student and might already, have a career or something like that, being able to take the time to get those veterinary experience hours can be really challenging, but are definitely really important. Depends on what your background is as well. So your degree so far, is that a science-based degree or is it something else? And then when you're looking at the prereqs for vet school, when were those completed? Some schools will have rules about how recently either all courses or especially the science courses need to be. That was something that I ran into as a non-traditional vet pre-vet. And so reaching out to the school about, sometimes it's in their FAQs, so check there. If you cannot find it on the website, you can reach out to the admissions office and ask them if there's any restrictions on how recent courses need to have been and options for non-traditional students. So yeah, great question. Any advice on getting a higher GPA? I've retaken an additional course, about 40 credits, completed 30 credit master degree as well, still not above 3.8 in my cumulative or science according to FEMCAS. Yeah. So good question here. Look at the statistics and see what the class profile looks and how you rank compared to the average GPA of applicants, the schools you're looking at. Having retaken those classes is helpful. Depends on how the vet school will look at those. Some of the vet schools will still consider the first time you took that class, some will replace with the new score and then that master's degree. To a point, I kind of wonder what your master's degree is in. Is that a science-based master's or what did that look like? Being able to explore that a little bit more. That would be a great question for the Apply Smarter message board. See here, I commute to campus and most clubs start late at school. I foster for my shelter, so I don't want to leave the dogs alone for too long. Extracurriculars are a weak point in my application. Was an undergrad teaching assistant for 3 semesters working with farm animals on campus. Will that be enough or will you recommend trying to get more extracurriculars? Yeah, so one of the things with extracurriculars is that experience working with groups, teams, and leadership, right? And so usually an easy way to do that is through extracurricular experiences. But are you also able to exhibit those skills through other experiences if there are restrictions in participating in extracurriculars, right? We talked to somebody that's a non-traditional student earlier, so it's not unheard of to have low extracurricular experience. You mentioned fostering for the shelter and being a TA, right? So what are the leadership experiences that you've gotten through there? What are the different skills that you've been able to build through those experiences? Talk about, working with a team and in groups and how has that impacted those experiences and those skill sets? It doesn't necessarily have to be through an extracurricular specifically. It can be through some of those other experiences as well. Oh, okay, follow-up question for the veterinary medicine loan repayment program. Will they take that money back after 3 years if you decide to move out of that area? Um, yeah, I think Tony had to drop off. He's a little bit more experienced with that than I am. Great question for the Apply Smarter message board. Again, we can really dive into that. My understanding is it depends a little bit. That is a possibility that you would have to pay that money back if you did not complete that agreement of having worked there for the 3 years. It depends on sort of how it's handled on a case by case basis, is my understanding. But Tony's definitely got some more experience with that one. It would be a great question for the Apply Smarter message board. How bad would a C be on a transcript for vet school if my overall GPA is still high? Biochem isn't going the best right now. I had 2 biochem tutors. I just want to make that known, and still somehow made it to vet school. So biochem's a beast. You know what? Can you retake biochem if you do get a C, right? Sometimes that second exposure to a subject can help you to get a better score. Can you hire a tutor for the rest of the semester? Can you hire 2 tutors for the rest of the semester to try and work on your class there? You know, having one class that has a C is not the end all be all. I hear that from pre-vets all the time. Oh, I got a C in this class. I'll never be able to make it into vet school. That is not the end all be all of your application, right? How are you doing in your other courses? What is your overall science GPA? And then again, like, what are those things that make you a competitive applicant other than your GPA, right? What are the leadership experiences? What are your team building experiences? Do you have diverse veterinary experience? All of those things go into that application as well. All right, what's a good way to find potential vet experience opportunities other than Googling local vet practices? Are there any overlooked areas or specialties that may not normally have people asking for shadowing opportunities? Many, depending on where you are, many of your veterinarians still like a very traditional approach to seeking out those opportunities, right? So getting on the phone and asking to speak to a veterinarian, to, you know, the lead veterinarian, the medical director, whatever that may be at that hospital, and introducing yourself and asking about those things. Stopping by with a paper resume could be a good opportunity as well, to be able to introduce yourself and explain who you are, why you're looking to get some shadowing hours. If your college or university has a pre-vet club, sometimes you can connect with shadowing experiences through there, or, you know, graduates of that college or university that have gone on to be veterinarians and work in the local area will sometimes enjoy giving back to the school and having pre-vet shadow. So utilize that. If you've got a pre-vet advisor at your school, they may know some of the veterinarians in the area that will be willing to take on pre-vet students. So use some of those resources in order to try and find those different experiences. Is it possible for a veterinary medicine student to become a human medic? Yeah, interesting question there. So it depends on your career path. Those are 2 different things. And so if you wanted to switch to human medicine after veterinary medicine, you can't just switch over to a different species of human based on your vet degree. So that would require going to medical school. Any tips on getting research experience? I've struggled with where to get that from. Similar to the shadowing experiences, if you're at a college or university that has a pre-vet club, reach out to that, you know, join that pre-vet club and see if there's connections through there. Some of your, especially if you know, your prereqs and things like that, introducing yourself to those faculty members and asking if they have any research going on, explaining that you're looking to apply to vet school and looking to get some research experience and learn about that. Any of these experiences, whether it's research or vet experience, please do not approach it as I'm just trying to check the box so I can apply to vet school. Really engage with those experiences and the people who are offering those opportunities to you. Try to learn as much as you can and really, really gain something from that, and also give back to those, right? Like be a good team player and participate and help out where you can. So definitely take advantage of those. Is it worth it to pursue research experience if you're only able to do it over the summer? I've heard in the past that some vet schools are looking for more in-depth experience. Yeah, that'll depend on vet school to vet school. I think that would be a great question for the once you narrow down your list of target schools to reach out to them and ask if there's a preference of, is that research experience better, spent in one area, or is it okay if you look at a couple of different things? That would be a good question for each of the schools individually, because I'm sure they handle that a little different. Kimberly says, I'm 26 and non-traditional. Do colleges look differently at this? It depends on what you mean by differently. I do think those life experiences are, those are definitely acknowledged. I don't know that they're looked at differently. You've probably got some different experiences and been able to build a different skill set than some of the other applicants. And so that will stand out in your application. If there's specific things that you're concerned about as far as being a non-traditional student, and if a vet school would look at that a little differently, I would encourage you to reach out on that Apply Smarter message board, and we can dive into that a little bit more there. Planning on applying this cycle as a 19-year-old, I would be starting at 20. Do you think this will help or hurt my application? No effect at all. I took almost 50 hours in high school. I graduate next month with my associates and will graduate next summer with my bachelor's. Awesome. Good luck. So, age, in my experience, you're not going to be looked at based on your age. Like we discussed during the talk, there's a number of early admissions programs at the different vet schools and things like that. And so those programs are pretty consistently accepting people that are your age. So I don't really think it's going to have much effect. It's really just going to depend on your GPA, your skills, your letters of recommendation, your veterinary experience hours. Those are the things that are going to end up being the most important over time. 23 years old with limited experience and may not be a competitive applicant. So I consider taking a gap year to gain more experience, improve my English since it's not my first language. I am just worried that if I start too late on the application process, or if I take 2 to 3 years of gap years. So you've mentioned you have limited experience. It would be interesting to know kind of what your overall application looks like. And why do you feel like that's a limited experience? Is that based on hours, diversity of types of experience? In general, with gap years, vet school doesn't get cheaper over time. Is usually how that ends up working out. So I don't often recommend delaying vet school solely because you think you need more experience. Like I would definitely look at like what are your experiences? Do you feel like you're a competitive applicant and would be able to get in sooner rather than later? And again, reach out to those schools, right? And so talk to them about those things. Introduce yourself. Explain, what experiences you have, and get some feedback from the Office of Admissions about how your application looks and things like that, and what are the average number of hours that their applicants or their admitted students have, and be able to compare there. I work in a single vet GP that sees small animals and exotics. I have shadowed vets in shelter med, zoo med, zoo and wildlife. I have experience in research with avian viruses. Would you still recommend I shadow vets at other GPs, especially since mine is a single vet practice, to try and get other diverse experience with different species such as large animals? Yeah, great question. So you've got a number of diverse experiences already. It depends on, in my experience, it depends on where those hours fall. Are the bulk of your hours going to be with that one veterinarian? And you have very limited number of hours in each of those other categories, or are your experience hours kind of spread across those? Because you do have quite a few diverse experiences already. And so if those hours are spread across all of those experiences, then you've been able to work with more than one veterinarian. And would also be a good question to reach out to those admissions committees or the Office of Admissions and talk with them about. If moving to a state that has a vet school and great question, and living there for a year, will you have the same application standards as the residents there, or will it be out of state requirements? Great question. So we discussed those handful of schools that will allow you to change residency after the first year. Pretty much every other school, once you start vet school as an out-of-state student, you cannot switch to in-state residency status. The option is to change your residency status before applying to vet school. Check with the Office of Admissions. Does it depend on your residency status when you apply or when you start vet school? Because that will depend on if it's when you apply, you're probably going to need to live in that state for a year before you even apply, versus if it's when you start school, when you matriculate, then you could potentially move there, apply, and then be there, a year beforehand. Most of those situations, as I'm referencing, you do have to live in that state and work in that state for a year to establish residency before you're considered in the resident application pool. So I actually know that Dr. Bartels did that. He moved to Colorado and lived there and worked for a year and then applied to Colorado State Vet School as a resident applicant at that time. Most places, a year that you have to live there, you do have to work, like you have to show that you're like living there and not just being there for switching your residency status. So again, if you're looking at a certain school and planning to change your residency status, it's not a unique question that they've never heard before. So you could reach out to the school and ask again, how does that kind of work in that area? What are the state requirements? Thanks so much. You're very welcome. I want to use this medium to ask about the VIN Foundation scholarship that we applied for in 2023. Is there any update for those that have been chosen? Jordan, I'm going to kick this over to you.
Sure. So
I don't ever get to do that.
So for the Mike Dunn Veterinary Student Scholarship, for those that don't know, we do have a scholarship which we are hoping to do annually, which opened for the first time in towards the fall of 2023 and is for those entering in fall of 2024. And it is two $140,000 scholarships for veterinary students who will be attending veterinary school within the US. And there is some criteria on how much the school can cost you. We capped it at 170, even though you're getting 140 or have the opportunity to get 140 in an effort to keep student debt costs down so that students are set up for success when they graduate with less debt. So if you applied for that scholarship and you received, we have been sending emails as people are making them to each different phase. So if you received an email within the last month saying that you made it to the next phase, then you are in that next phase. And any additional updates of timing, et cetera, will be put on the website.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, that's a really exciting opportunity that we've done for the first time this year. It's really unique in that it is a scholarship opportunity that you apply for while you're applying to vet school before you start vet school. Thank you, Jordan, for dropping that link in the chat. And so definitely check that out, because that is a vet school. There's scholarships available for vet school. Finding a high dollar scholarship can be really challenging. It's not quite like in undergrad where you may get like a full ride scholarship. Those are very, very few and far between. And so the Mike Dunn veterinary student scholarship is a big deal of how much that award is offering. So definitely check that one out. All right. And then I think we got our last question here. Any certain amount of hours working in a clinic that would be acceptable to get into vet school? Yeah, so that depends on the vet school that you're looking to apply, because each school has some different different rules there. So some schools may require a certain number of hours. Other schools it may not matter how many hours you get. Many of the schools that do require a certain number of hours will tell you a minimum number of hours. I will encourage you to look at the accepted student statistics, because often you'll find that the number of students that are accepted have way more hours than what that minimum requirement is. That is one of the resources that's available on vetschoolbound.org, is what experience do I need for vet school? That's actually one of the things that we're still in process of updating. And so we hope to have that soon. And that will have some additional updated information about what each vet school requires, if that information is available. You can also check on each vet school's website for that information as well. So. All right, with that, I think we have answered all of the questions. All right, well, thank you all so much for joining. I hope you found this helpful. Definitely give us any feedback. Please explore the tools on Vet School Bound. Give us feedback on those. We're constantly trying to improve them. That's been a huge project that we've been working on for the last year. As well as check out those blog posts on vinfoundation.org. You can check out those Apply Smarter blog posts and look at some of the different things that have been written up over the years from various pre-vet students, vet students, about applying to vet school. Do apply, do sign up for that Apply Smarter message board access. Again, it's free. We just ask that you create a username and a password so that you can log in and interface with the 100,000 veterinarians and vet students worldwide and ask all of your questions. If you have feedback on the webinar, please email us at applysmarter@vinfoundation.org. We'll be sending out a follow-up email to everybody that registered with the link to the Prezi. Prezi will have all the links that we've discussed, as well as the recording and some other helpful information. And so with that, thank you so much and good luck. Let us know if there's anything we can do to help.